Okay, here's a map of World War II that's integrated into a PowerPoint, and it follows the land movements of the war. It's not the most important thing to know, but of all the wars we've studied, this is most important to understand the different movements. So I'll let the presentation speak for itself and give you a couple points to look at as it goes through. Okay, here's Germany during the Weimar Republic. You can tell by the regular German flag, and then in 1933 in come the Nazis with the Ruhr Valley and the Rhineland still unoccupied as by the Versailles Treaty. This is the beginning of appeasement as the Rhineland is occupied. Then he takes over Austria, the Sudetenland, and the rest of Czechoslovakia. Italy and Mussolini start pushing into Albania, and finally the war begins. So in 1939, Hitler moves into Poland, and with an agreement that they have a non-aggression pact, the Soviet Union divides Poland for the 5th time in our course history. And now we'll just move through the basic movements of the war. So up until the invasion of Poland, that was the only time when he had to fire shots, and it was then when Britain said, if you don't withdraw from Poland, we're at war, and they are. The main reason for the occupation of Denmark and Norway is something historians call geopolitical domination. They need the raw materials from the Norwegian oil fields and the iron ore deposits from Norway and Denmark. So it's a relative weak government to take over, but he's looking at getting the resources he needs to supply his army. And for the 3rd time in 50 years, Germany goes through Belgium to attack France. And for the 3rd time in 60 years, France does not have anything along the border with Belgium. And in 6 weeks, they take over Paris. And you can see the north half of France has a swastika on it, which is the Nazi-occupied France. And the southern half is called the Vichy government, which is essentially a French puppet government for the Nazis. So they occupy the area that has the English Channel and the North Sea, and they let the French puppet government run the southern half of France. The bombings of London are called the, or what Churchill called the battle for France is over, and the battle for Britain is about to begin. They call it the London bombing. It goes on for months. They start bombing at nighttime, and when they switch to, or rather they start bombing during the day and switch to nighttime bombing because the Royal Air Force does such a good job of picking off the German fighters. But the bombing of London is brutal, and they have to pick up the blocks every morning after the nighttime bombing and try and pick it up block for block. But the Battle of London, or the London Blitz, is not successful. If you remember, the British had the connections with the Greeks going back to the 1820s. They're occupying Greece to try and hold the Dardanelles in the entrance of the Black Sea, and to have a supply route to the Soviet Union, as the Soviet Union they see will become an ally. But the Greeks occupy, or the London British government occupies the Greeks. Then you can see the Greeks are driven out, and you can notice that even though it's Italian, closer to Italy than it is German, the Germans are really the chief people here. Hitler did not expect Mussolini's army to be able to be very successful, and we'll find out later, in fact, he's correct. But the Greeks are pushed back, but as you can see, Britain still has Crete, with it still an attempt to try and get through the Dardanelles to the Black Sea. With what is called Operation Barbarossa, you can see that the non-aggression pact between the Soviet Union and the Nazis are over, and once again the German army pushes in to Russia, almost to the edge of Moscow. You can see Leningrad in the top corner, and you can't see it on the map, but Stalingrad is the southeast corner of the push by the Soviet Union. You can see the Americans enter by 41, and their first landing is in North Africa. They're going to try and push down into the Suez region so that Britain again can control their pathway to India. And with what Churchill called the soft underbelly of Europe, the agreement with Roosevelt was that the Americans would push forth through Italy, Churchill seeing Italy as the weakest part of the European stronghold for the Nazis and Italians. So as they prepare to invade Normandy, they're pushing up through Italy, and the Americans see action in North Africa, and then they'll push up through Italy. They're hoping that Germany will have to use its resources to shore up Italy, which is in fact what happens. So Churchill wins big points with Roosevelt, and Roosevelt will trust him the rest of the war. You can see the occupation of Italy by the Nazis. So at this point Mussolini is a puppet, and the Germans have to reinforce all along the line. So now the Germans are stretched to the Normandy coast of France to put the barrier against the North Sea and the potential invasion. They're fighting along the Eastern Front with the Soviet Union, and now they have to fight a third front on the Italian peninsula. Soviet Union uses their massive amounts of men to try and push back the Nazis. It's the winter get to the Nazis as well. It's at this point that Stalin is asking Roosevelt and Churchill to invade Normandy, to invade France, to open a Western Front, and it will be another year before that happens. These are the famous bombing raids used by the Royal Air Force and the American Air Corps. They're bombing the industrial centers. They talk about the Nazis bringing the war to the people rather than the armies. Well, this is definitely the Allied version of that. They're carpet bombing cities. Carpet bombing makes it just what it sounds like. Rather than trying to target one piece, they throw massive amounts of bombs over blocks and blocks and blocks in hopes to keep one factory out of commission. Long-range bombers are escorted by the Royal Air Force and the American Air Corps, take huge hits. The B-17s are lucky if they complete their tour, which can be as little as 10 runs, and almost half of them do not make it. But it's the American industrial might that it was able to put out so many hundreds of aircraft that even if they lose the aircraft, they're still able to keep the bombing going. And finally comes the invasion of Normandy, nicknamed D-Day. And you can see the Soviet Union is beginning to push. The bubble that's formed in the Soviet Union is one of the great brilliant pieces by Stalin and his generals to actually outwit the Nazis, and he had laid miles and miles of barriers and really sucked the Nazis in and then laid a trap for them. So it's a supreme victory for the Soviet Union, which is usually not the case. It's the famous Battle of the Bulge, the last offensive that Germany has. You can see it's quite obvious that the end is near, and unlike World War I, where they actually gave up when they realized they couldn't win, the Nazis refuse, and this is where the assassinations of Hitler start to begin and the plots against him, and some of the commanders start questioning whether Hitler can actually command the Nazis anymore. Soviet Unions are the first ones to liberate Berlin, and they're actually there, and this is where Hitler kills himself in his bunker. You can still see there's still parts of occupation zones of the Nazis, but when the homeland is gone or the fatherland is gone, the Nazis begin to form a committee to sign a peace treaty, and Hitler has killed himself in this bunker in Berlin. Now, forecasting into our next unit, here's the beginning of the Cold War, the occupation zones of Germany. You can see the American, the British, the French, and the Soviet areas of influence. We'll break this down into Eastern and Western Germany, and the capital city of Berlin, right above the Soviet flag, is broken down that way as well. So that's it, what we have for this World War II. It's worth knowing some of those bits and pieces, but it also gives you a timeline overview of how it all works.